Good evening and welcome to another episode of Fresh Natural and Live. We are here in Houston and we have an interesting show tonight. I would like to say it's exciting. However, I think the content is not going to be very pleasant. We're going to talk about China's control over U.S. healthcare. I'm going to repeat that. We're going to talk about China's control over U.S. healthcare. I was talking to a colleague just the other day about a patient I was managing in the hospital, and this patient went in with an arrhythmia. It was an abnormal heart rhythm, heart's beating fast, and her enzyme levels had increased. We knew she had coronary disease. She had a stent placed a number of weeks ago, and we were discussing the management of her care. Although we did not have an intention of emergently doing a heart catheterization, we contemplated doing one electively. However, my colleague shared with me that, they're not doing elective heart caths because there's a shortage of contrast material. And I said, what? And so I looked up some articles, and of course, sure enough, we're facing a shortage of contrast material. So this reminded me of a book that I had started reading, China RX, and a topic that I had started looking into a while back, and I thought it'd be important to revisit that topic, and it's related to China's control over our healthcare system. You don't want to miss this information tonight. Give us the thumbs up, like, subscribe. We're going to be right back with a very, very important topic. Okay, and welcome back. As I said, we have an interesting topic tonight, and it's related to China's control over our healthcare. I think it's something that you want to make notes on, and actually invite each of you to do some research on your own related to this topic. We'll share some articles with you, but first and foremost, I want to invite some of my friends and colleagues on the stage. We have Dr. Pamela Atkins. Hello, Dr. Atkins. How are you today?
Hi, good evening. Doing well. How are you?
Okay. Your mic is a little low, but I can hear you a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to turn my speaker up. Hope I can get my speaker may be down. And of course, Dr. Palmer, how are you today? You have a delay.
I'm well. I'm
okay.
Something
I
is
hear
going
you
on.
now.
Okay, let me go back out and come back in.
Okay. Looks like China has
I
taken
can
over
see
Dr.
myself, but I can't
Palmer's.
see you all. So let me go out and come back in.
Okay, I'll remove you. All right. China has taken over Dr. Palmer's mic and AV system. She's coming back. Let me see if I can bring her back on. Hello, everyone. Hello, Anne. And hello, can't pronounce the Chinese letters. Hello, JW, and everyone else in the chat. But anyway, as I was saying in the intro, I was made aware of this contrast shortage. I don't, Dr. Atkins, were you aware of the contrast shortage? Ayumi, hello, Ayumi, and Norma Ada.
Made aware of that.
Yeah, so I'm going to share this audience while I wait till Dr. Palmer gets back connected. So this article here shares, let me see if I can enlarge it. Yep. It is, let me see here. There's Dr. Palmer. How's it now, Dr. Palmer?
Okay, it was my Wi-Fi.
Okay. So anyway, COVID shutdowns in China are delaying medical scans in the U.S. Now, this was the article that prompted me to do this show. It's more than just contrast. I think it's more than just COVID, more than just COVID shutdowns. But the gist of this article, doctors in the United States are prioritizing only the most critical patients, and hospitals are rationing supplies of a crucial drug after a COVID lockdown in China temporarily closed the GE healthcare factory. That is a vital source for a key ingredient. Now, GE has factories over there, and many of our drug makers and medical consumable makers are in China. The shutdown of the facility in Shanghai in April halted production of contrast media, an iodine solution that medical staff inject into blood vessels to allow a device such as a CT scanner or fluoroscope to be used inside the body. Contrast media, also known as dye, is used virtually every hour at hospitals across the country to help measure arterial blockages around the heart, guide placement of stents in catheter labs, diagnose and treat strokes. The more oncologists use contrast to monitor cancerous tumors. For example, I was called in the middle of the night by the daughter of a patient of mine who had a massive stroke. Of course, she's not following a plant-based diet. And she had to go for an emergent procedure to have a thrombectomy, have the blood clot removed from an artery in her brain. That required the use of contrast. I have a patient admitted to the hospital recently with an enzyme bump, and we were contemplating doing a corneal angiogram. And that's when my colleague told me, look, there's a contrast shortage. We're not doing elective corneal angiograms. Now, she didn't really need it. We know what her corneal anatomy is. We knew why her enzymes bumped. It was due to an arrhythmia, which we treated with an ablation. Excuse me. However, these are just two examples that happened just in the last 24 hours in my situation. In my profession, for many, many patients, hundreds, thousands of patients I've injected contrast with. Is very important media, drug, however you want to describe it, to be used in a diagnostic setting. And so this is a situation where it's problematic. So they quoted Dr. Peter Kahn. He's a cardiologist in South Coast Health's Carleton Memorial Hospital in Falls River, Massachusetts. We have about 5 days worth on hand. It's a crisis that I've never had as a clinician, that I have not had to deal with in my entire career. This is something completely out of our hands. It's not something that we have control over. So, this is a major problem in terms of, the contrast media being shut down. We're totally dependent on a foreign country. We don't have the ability to make this drug, but it goes beyond this. So as I said, I started thinking back upon a book I read, China RX. I'm actually going to share a couple of videos with you with the author in that book, which is going to be very important. But what I found is that, back in, and many of you may be aware of this, but in 2008, there was an outbreak of deaths of people using heparin. And it was published in a number of articles. Here's one that says a total of 152 adverse reactions associated with heparin were identified in 113 patients from 13 states from November 19, 2007 to January 31st, 2008. Essentially what happened was this, China again produces heparin. They because they like pork more than we do in the United States, which is hard to imagine. They have more pigs. So they use material from pig intestines, the lining of the pig intestines, as a key ingredient for the heparin. Well, around 2006, 2007, they had, I think 2006, they had a problem with a viral infection of the pigs. And so they had to use an alternative ingredient. So this alternative ingredient was used in place of pig intestines, which was much more toxic. Now I can only imagine anything being more toxic than pig intestine, but I guess there is. But nevertheless, it caused people to die. It caused an acute inflammatory reaction. It caused excess blood clotting and bleeding, and resulted in major deaths. Now, they were able to quantify hundreds of deaths, beyond this report. But there are many other people who may have died without knowing, because oftentimes people who are getting contrast are very sick, or people who are getting heparin are very sick. You come in with a stroke or heart attack, etc. You get the heparin, and maybe you die acutely, and you say, well, they died from the heart attack, but the heparin could have done it. And one dialysis center, they had a situation where there were two young patients getting dialysis. I say young, relatively young, and both died in the same center. And so it was, of course, unfortunate, but it was critical that you had two people die, had an acute reaction. That resulted in investigating this because it was highly unusual. And I had only one person die that said, well, this person had an allergic reaction. They may have just, blown it off and not investigated further. So nevertheless, this was investigated, and this was one of the lead situations that led to further investigation of this heparin. But this is, back in 2008. The others, and there are many other examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for instance, recently, this is fairly recent. Many of you may remember this, but some antihypertensive drugs, particularly losartan. And this article here talks about recall of common blood pressure medication. Losartan has been expanded for the 5th time after manufacturer Torrent Pharmaceuticals found a possibly carcinogenic impurity in more batches of the drug. And so this is one of a series of drug recall. Also, Zantac, as you remember, and some of you may have seen some of the legal class action lawsuits regarding Zantac, probably carcinogen. Again, these are generic drugs. Now, what most of us don't know is that, and on this video I'm going to share, China rather, has controlled about 90% of the key ingredients to generic drugs worldwide. Some are about 80 to 90%. And so, and many of our manufacturers, the generic manufacturers, are in China, and they're not regulated by the FDA because they're a sovereign country. The FDA can't get into these places and regulate them. They certainly weren't doing it during COVID. So these drugs are just shipped over, and they're relabeled. So you may have Baxter Pharmaceutical or Pharmaceutical F that says, okay, we're providing this drug, but the key ingredient comes from China, and they don't know which facility it came from. And so you have, adverse outcomes. You find carcinogens. And China has openly admitted that they will do things to our drugs and so on. So we're going to hear from Rosemary Gibson, who's the author of the China RX, who's going to share some insight. I think it's going to be very, very important for us to be aware of this. But one other little article I'm going to share with you, and this is a nice little article. It documents the first use of penicillin in the United States. It was a pregnant lady. She was at Yale New Haven Hospital. It was in March 12th, 1942. So she was dying of septicemia. Now she'd been, had fever for about 2 weeks. So the doctor caring for her went through special measures to get a hold of penicillin. It was very new at that time. They had used it in England, and this, of course, during World War II, and so he had some connections there. But long story short, she got the drug. Within 24 hours, her fever had subsided. She started getting more doses, and they saw that about 95% of the intravenous dose was excreted unchanged. They were giving her a pretty high dose. They were able to take her urine. They carried gallons of the urine back to Rahway, and they were able to make more or reproduce more penicillin from the urine from this patient. Now, she died at the age of 90 years old of some unrelated issue. So that was quite interesting that she had that situation. So the U.S. was making quite a bit of penicillin. Today, we do not make penicillin. Okay, we get key ingredients from China, and so that's a major problem that we're dealing with because we don't have the ability to produce our own drugs. And so one thing we want to talk about tonight, we want to sort of examine this problem. And what I'd like to do is get us to A, talk about the nature of it, and B, talk about some related issues, and have a few comments on what we can do to avoid our dependency on medications and therefore on the pharmaceutical industry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a two-part video with the audience. First of all, colleagues, do you have any comments before I throw the video up? No, Dr. Palmer, we were talking about baby formula. I have a video on the lady selling baby formula also. I'll share that as well. Okay. Anyway, so let me do this. I'm going to remove us all from, let me see here.
So it's not just China. China's taking advantage of American greed. And this kind of greed can kill. And it has killed.
It has killed?
Absolutely. China RX opens up with a story of a Johns Hopkins trained physician. And he was out in Arizona, had a great practice as a radiologist, and he knew he had a stomach ulcer. He self-diagnosed correctly. And it was getting painful. So late one night, he and his wife and kids, they stopped in at the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale emergency room. And they said, why don't you stay overnight? Your wife and children go home and pick you up tomorrow morning. We'll just do a test, scope the inside to see what's going on. And you'll be on your way. So at 6 the next morning, he got a blood thinner and another dose at about 10 in the morning. Healthy guy, 45 years old, and by 10:30, he was showing signs of having a heart attack. No history of heart disease. So they put him in the cath lab, and they gave him more of this blood thinner. And he went into, very quickly, multiple organ failure. And this is all documented. They spent months and months and months finding a case, because this is like the perfect crime. It's really hard to find, to show cause and effect. And the following week, his heart was so damaged, they just took it out of his body. He was put on an artificial heart machine. The next month, he's sitting up in bed in the hospital with his wife next to him, watching the evening news, tethered to this artificial heart machine. And on the news, it's been reported that contaminated heparin, a blood thinner, was found in St. Louis hospitals. And he turned to his wife and said, oh my God, I got a lot of heparin. Was it contaminated? Long story short, 3 months later, he died after a failed Hail Mary transplant. And it was a horrific death. And the FDA traced this contaminant back to China, where for economic reasons, they put in a fake substitute for the real thing. And at high levels, this was lethal. And there were hundreds of people who died, and we don't even know the full numbers, because it's so hard to tell if you're chronically ill and was it the drug? What is it? It's very, very hard to tell. So that was 2007 and 8, and decade later, what did we get? Contaminated blood pressure medicine that millions of Americans were taking, and this had a rocket fuel compound in it.
Rocket fuel.
And I was giving testimony to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and a member of the commission, retired military, a very fine gentleman, Army colonel, he spoke up extemporaneously. This was not his testimony. He says, yeah, I got blood pressure medicine from China and it had rocket fuel in it. He said, if I'm getting it as retired military, that means our active duty people are getting it too. And it was sourced in China. This is how bad it's gotten. It's shocking.
You make a very good point in the book that so this is being done because on the surface, it's cheaper to buy from China. But really, we can't afford to do this.
It's insanity. If you want to buy a cheap T-shirt, go right ahead. And we can go find the cheapest T-shirt somewhere, but you're going to do that with the medicines that you depend on for your life? There was just an article published in a really reputable medical journal about a medicine given to people after heart and lung transplants. And they had doctors had it tested, at Harvard, and it turns out it wasn't dissolving properly in the body. So that means if you're taking a medicine that's supposed to last 6 hours or 8 hours, and if it doesn't dissolve evenly, that means the last couple of hours, you're not getting protection. This is an immunosuppressant, which you really need if you're getting a new organ in your body.
In other words, your organ could fail because of the Chinese poor quality medicine. I think
Right.
what's crazy to me about what you're bringing up is that the case of the heart thinner that you brought up was about the same time as the melamine milk scandal in China. That was 2008. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm never going to buy food from China if I can ever avoid it, because you never know. But because of the way that like our healthcare system works, like the consumers are very rarely making choices about what they buy or how much they spend on what they buy, because you've got these middlemen, right? The insurance companies, and often other middlemen as well.
Yeah, most Americans have no idea they're getting these Chinese-made drugs.
Right. And you're buying it from like, your trusted, Walgreens or CVS, and you think like, oh, well, like, surely they're not going to sell me bad medicine because they'd get sued. So I trust them. But it's not that simple, because even they're not necessarily liable for it because they're getting it from someone else who's then sourcing it from China. And so you have these complexities of the supply chain. But I think the core of it, Rosemary, is that the individual consumers have no way to make a choice because they don't have any way to understand the supply chain for an individual thing that they're taking.
That's exactly right. We don't see the box that it comes in, even when we go to a retail pharmacy, and we're certainly not going to see where stuff comes from if we're in the hospital. It's the last thing we'll be thinking of. But in the last couple of weeks, I've been given some thought to this. I called up a very well-known retail pharmacy chain, and they sell this Chinese generic blood pressure medicine that didn't control this person's blood pressure and put her in dangerous, life-threatening territory. Just think about this. Imagine if you're going to buy tires, and I'll just use the example of Costco or any other. Imagine if Costco, they're not doing this. Imagine if Costco were buying tires from China. And let's say that these manufacturing plants are supposed to be inspected by the federal government, the places making these tires, and let's say they got a warning letter, or we know that there's problems, that they're not very well regulated, and that these tires could blow out on the highway when you're going 65 miles an hour. The American public would still hold Costco accountable for selling defective tires. And as a pharmacy, the whole industry all these special interests know that FDA doesn't test these drugs before they're being sold. And for the past year, the FDA has done hardly any inspections in China and elsewhere because of COVID. So we are effectively importing unregulated product. So there's I think that sense of, well, how should these retail stores know? I'll tell you, they should know. They should absolutely know. And I think it's only going to get worse, regrettably. But sometimes things have to get bad until they get fixed. And I think it's going to hit the fan someday. And if you're a retail pharmacy and you're selling product to the American people that is defective and results in harm, then they are not immune to liability.
So quite an impelling testimony, in a sense that, and Dr. Rosemary Gibson has testified before Congress, as she alluded to, and in other settings. And this is quite striking. I can tell you my experience, and I'd like to hear from both of you. Frequently, this has been since my training years. I have situations where I have a patient on a drug, and typically it's a generic drug, and they're taking it for a certain period of time, and all of a sudden they may get an adverse reaction. a blood pressure medicine will stop, quote unquote, working. A blood thinner will stop, quote unquote, working. I've had a situation where a patient will have a situation in where, in one particular situation, I remember a lady was on warfarin, which is a blood thinner, and we measure the INR levels to see how, quote unquote, thin your blood is, how an indirect way of looking at the drug efficacy. And you want it, in certain patients, you want it between INR of 2 and 3. And so I kept increasing the dose of her medication, and she was on a relatively high dose, and we'd just gotten her INR between 2 and 3. Then a few months later, she shows up in the emergency room, and INR is like 15 to 20. Now, she apparently gotten a different warfarin prescription, and the warfarin prescription I gave her was generic X. And then later on, she got generic Y. Generic X probably had, 1/5 or 1/10 of the potency of the generic Y. So when I had her on a certain dose, then I had to increase the dose of this generic. But then what happens when you go to the pharmacy will switch makers because, they may get a better price from, generic company Y versus generic company X. And so the generic drug you're getting from 1 month to the next is a different drug. And it's like Russian roulette. And this has been my experience over the years with certain, it's worse with some drugs versus others. Thyroid medications have had problems. We've had problems with and antihypertensive, as I alluded to. But this is something we've seen before now, more recently, finding carcinogenic agents in medications. And the medications in the purest form have side effects. So the medication by itself is bad enough. So then if you're looking at, putting, carcinogenic molecules in it or manipulating the effective component of the drug, you're really getting into a situation where it's pretty dire straits to be on medication and to have to rely on medications for that reason. Dr. Atkins, Palmer, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
You sounded really far away.
Okay, how about now?
That's a little better.
Okay, yeah, it's just very upsetting. I think we need, our country needs to have more dependence on, our own, make more of our own pharmaceuticals. But I mean, it's not just China. There's some pharmaceuticals that come from India, and there are other countries, but we need to have more, we need to be more independent because it's hard to, have quality insurance. We need to ask more questions about, batch, quality assurance of different, how often they do batches and etc. But yes, generic drugs are a concern because in medicine, it's just thought that the basic generic medication is in there, but there's other additives in there. There are different combinations of additives, coloring, and other things. So sometimes that someone can be sensitive to that, or that could be tainted. So it is extremely upsetting. And I think it really encourages your population that's listening to it, the people that are listening, your listenership, to really take care of our bodies, because as we don't take care of our bodies and we need more prescription medications, we are running the risk of maybe coming in contact with medications that have some problems or contaminated or worse. So we just, we need to be more dependent on our own. It's almost like the oil, petroleum oil and gasoline, being less dependent on other countries, but more dependent on our country. And you mentioned Abbott Lab and the problem with formula, and the Abbott Lab that was closed down because there was a problem and some reactions. But it's a crisis now for mothers with infants.
Yeah, I have a short video on that, on a lady who's selling breast milk. And so that's going to be something I'm going to get Dr. Palmer's take on that. So I take it, Dr. Atkins, you're promoting the America First concept.
Well, I'm just saying that, I'm just saying we need to have more knowledge about what we are giving to our patients, and we need, and what comes in the country and what the FDA approves or doctors feel that is the medication that they're delivering to their patients. I mean, it's very scary, hoping it will do good and it does harm. So I'm not saying, United States, we're perfect, but we need more quality insurance, quality control with these medications. And I hate when pharmacies substitute generic for medication I've prescribed, because it is not always, it's not the same formula. There are different additives, and so you have to specify not to, substitute.
Yeah, that's important. I think it's an important point for people to understand. The point you made is that, the generic drug is not the same as the brand drug, and the efficacy can vary. And like I said, you have different additives, and there's not one generic drug. There may be 15 different makers of the same drug. And so you got 15 different drugs with 15 different potencies and 15 different additive combinations. And so even in of itself, it's a Russian roulette. And then you add on top of that China manipulating it. And you're right, India makes a large amount of drugs, but they depend on China for about 80% of the raw ingredients. So China controls 80 to 90% of the raw ingredients worldwide. And so if India gets a shortage, and we're depending on India for some of our drugs, they may cut things off because, they may need it for their population. And so it gets to be a major problem, or it hasn't been a major problem from the standpoint of drugs. Trinia Smith asked a good question. How do you research and find where your blood pressure meds are made? That's a great question. And what's pointed out, it wasn't highlighted so much in the interview that I showed, but it is very hard and next to impossible to find out where the active ingredients come from. You may have a company like Baxter Pharmaceutical making drug X, but the key ingredient to that drug comes from another company. Just like when they had the heparin breakout, they had a hard time tracing where those drugs come from. And even if they know they come from China, China does not let the FDA go in and investigate those plants. And some of those plants are just big warehouses that has a hole in the floor as the bathroom. And so the people working in crazy conditions, making the so-called pharmacological agents that you put in your system that's supposed to help your heart condition or diabetes or whatever the case is. And so it's disheartening. Dr. Palmer, any comments? There was a recent shortage on baby formula.
I was going to actually add to with the medications before we talk about the baby formula.
Sure. Okay.
I think sometimes people are, and we're talking about prescribed medicines, but this is true too of some of the other over-the-counter medicines that are at some of the discount variety stores. And they have been called out on it because some of the acetaminophen or ibuprofens that are store brand are also shipped over from China and without the regulations, and have been found to contain problem substances. The stores, it's kind of weird. It's like the stores are the stores are told they need to correct the problem. The store says, okay, they'll correct the problem. And then that's really it. That's like the check and balance of it. So when you're buying things from some of the stores, also keep in mind, it's not just the prescription, it's also some of the over-the-counter medications.
Yeah, and Zantac was an example of that. Had the carcinogenic, so it's over the counter now, and people take that like candy, and then you start getting a breakout in cancers, and then of course the the lawyers come out with the class action lawsuits. Before I go to this next video, I want to remind everybody, if you're enjoying this content, you find it to be useful, give us a thumbs up, hit that like button. That's all in the chat. Hit the like button. That helps give us favorable rating on that YouTube algorithm. Also, subscribe if you hadn't had time to, and share.